Good morning, everybody. My name is Mark Laumakis. I am a lecturer in the Department of Psychology at San Diego State University, where I've been for the last 23 years. I'm going to tell you what I do, and I'm going to tell you a tale of something that happened this spring that was completely unexpected. It was highly disruptive, yet we survived. And I'm going to talk about some of the ways in which I think we were able to leverage technology, including tools from Macmillan, to sort of get through this bumpiness in one of my two sections of intro psych. So what I teach on the next slide here is giant sections of introductory psychology. So I teach up to 500 students in each of two sections in fall and spring. My grand total of students taught over the 23 years is more than 34,000. I can fill up our basketball arena like 4 times. When I go out to eat, invariably somebody who is doing something with our meal has had me. For better or worse, I usually ask, like, how did it go? Are you going to spit in my food? What is going to happen here? This is actually a picture of my Tuesday, Thursday, 11 o'clock classroom, which is the one that got disrupted. It's in this beautiful building that we'll see on the next slide, called the Exercise and Nutritional Sciences Building, ENS. It showed up this time. It didn't with the first group. Always, by the way, the second and third presentation is better than the first one. So you guys are getting the improved version. So the ENS building here, really nice Spanish style building on campus. Looks fantastic. Like, I definitely want to teach in there. It's awesome. And then, it was closed until further notice. So you might be wondering, like, everybody's happy and beautiful and walking around and it's sunny and the building looks great. Like, what could have happened? Does anybody want to guess what happened?
Well, I wrote over with you, so that's not
okay, so you can't answer. Thank you for...
She just told me.
Okay, so you're ineligible too. Anybody want to guess what happened? I won't even use iClicker for this. You probably wouldn't guess what actually happened.
Electrical outage?
Cockroaches? What did you say?
Electrical outage?
Electrical? It was Legionnaire's disease,
Oh, wow.
which probably would not have been one of your first 10 or 12 or 30 choices. I grew up in Philadelphia. I think the original outbreak for Legionnaire's disease was in like 1970 something at a convention. It apparently has something to do with respiratory symptoms. And so anyway, that happened. I actually found out about it while taking a walk in my neighborhood, and I started cursing and swearing to myself as I'm walking, saying, oh boy. So it was an indefinite closure of this classroom. When this happened sequentially in the semester was basically right as we got to test number 1. So now I've got a natural experiment. I know we've got some econ folks in here. Econ folks love natural experiments. And now I got 2 groups, right? I've got an 8 o'clock section where I'm actually in a different classroom and it doesn't get closed. There's not Legionnaire's disease. And I keep teaching them in person all the way through. With this 11 o'clock class, basically, as we get to the quarter pole in the course, we are disrupted. I'll tell you what I did and how we survived that. For the next sort of half of the course, we were effectively thrown online. I get back with them for like 3 lectures. I was actually more emotional about getting back to them than they were. They just sort of didn't seem to care all that much. But ultimately we were able to get back together, and then their test 4 was kind of one where it was, some in-person teaching. So the plan versus the reality. So here's the plan, right? I always have a great plan for this course. I've been teaching it for forever. We do 4 tests, basically a test about every 4 weeks. They're 100 points each. So each of them is only 1/8 of their grade. This is purposeful in my instructional design. I tell them, if you look at the 4 tests, that's only half your grade. Each test is 1/8 of your grade. There are a lot of what I call easy points, and the easy points are the other 400. So learning curve quizzes, you're going to hear more about learning curve and achieve over the course of the next day and a half. These are adaptive quizzes. And adaptive quizzing basically means it adjusts to that student's level of understanding, so that, let's say for the, chapter 1, section A part of chapter 1, there's a target score of 400 points. You start answering questions and the first one might be worth 15. And then the next one is 15. The next one's 15. And you got them all right. Next one's now worth 30 and it's more difficult. So if you know what you're doing, the questions adjust and get more difficult. They're worth more points, right? The design is such that if you know what you're doing, you get done more quickly. You get to the target score more quickly by answering those more difficult questions. You know what you're doing, move on. If you're struggling on those first couple 15-point questions, it'll give you even easier questions, maybe 10 points. If you don't know what you're doing particularly well, you're then forced to spend more time on task, get more practice, more retrieval practice. So it's an ideal design. So those are a big chunk of the course. Another chunk, they're actually worth more than each of the tests, right? Worth almost 2 tests is a more traditional and summative, what's called chapter practice quiz. Again, in Achieve, I make them 1 point per question, 1 attempt, but they are, it's open book, it's open note, and it's untimed. There literally is no out of bounds for the chapter practice quizzes. All I want them to do, and this is again intentional in my instructional design, is I want them to engage with the content, and more than anything, I want them to look at the book. Because left to their own devices, 75% or more of them will do nothing with the book. And I have data where they self-report and narc on themselves and say, I do nothing. Basically, I had one semester where if you backed out everything other than coming to class, the mean number of hours outside of class, they self-reported was 1 hour per week outside of class, which is super depressing because I know that median is 0 because the mean was pulled up by the kids that were actually doing 10 to 12 hours. So there's a lot of depressing elements in this. The final part of their grade here is iClicker attendance and participation points. So I use them in ways like Grace was talking about, like we've already been doing here, some multiple choice types questions. I would really highlight what Grace mentioned about the ability to practice test type questions. For the first 4 weeks of my class, I do nothing but feed 3 or 4 questions per class meeting that are just like what they're going to see on test 1. And in the fall, I have first semester freshmen who have no idea what that first test might look like. And by the time we get to it, they've done 15 or 20 questions that are pulled from old tests. So those work really well. And now we will dramatically drop in the red X because that goes away when we're not in person. There is a way to use iClicker online, and I just didn't want to get that far into the weeds with these kids because it was disruptive enough. They had signed up for an in-person class. I had signed up for an in-person class, and suddenly we were moved online. Without getting too far into the weeds, if we stay on that just for 1 sec, what I ended up doing was I back-tested a way to not make it so that some of the points that were already in ended up counting for a larger percentage of the grade than otherwise would have been the case. If I drop that, I know we got some math people, this goes from 12.5% to 14.29%. I didn't feel great about that, so I said, let me massage the data. Let me look at my fall course, and let's pretend that I knocked out those 100 points. What would I have to do with that part of their grade to sort of have them land where they otherwise would have landed? What I came up with, I gave everybody 50 points out of 50 points for iClickers. It made those percentages closer to what they were originally planned to be. And when you give students 50 points, they're pretty damn happy. So I got no griping about grades in the 11 o'clock section when we were done. It didn't inflate it too much, but it did let me do what I was talking about a minute ago. So I'm going to talk now about some of the strategies I use for surviving this unexpected disruption this spring. It almost had echoes of COVID for me. I was like, oh my God, here we go again, right? So I mainly try to leverage technology in a couple different ways. If you're wondering, hey, well, what did you do with those 11 o'clock kids in terms of instruction? What I did was I used in my 8 o'clock section this thing called MediaSite. We're lucky enough to have this installed in all the lecture halls and many of the other classrooms. It's basically lecture recording software. I don't have to do anything to make it happen. It just happens. I don't even know how. It's magical. I was a guinea pig for the first version of this like 15 years ago, and I had to push 25 different buttons to make the recording happen, and now it just goes. Basically, what I did for the 11 o'clock students was I took the teaching that I did at 8, I shared a link to the recording of the 8 o'clock lecture, and basically they got the lecture at online via that link that I gave to the 8 o'clock students earlier that morning. So I was sharing that. What else was I doing? I was using those Achieve assignments. I think this is one of the key elements here, was having regular weekly assignments due. So I had a rhythm to the course such that it wasn't the case that like I waited until the end of part 1 and had 4 weeks worth of assignments due. That does not work well with first semester freshmen. Right? You need more frequent lower stakes assessments like this to herd the cats, right? To keep them on track is really what I'm doing there. So the learning curve and the chapter practice quizzes really help with that. Other things that I had here was very frequent and some of these even dad mode announcements, trying to help them keep them on track. So if you do the math there, that's 4 a week. Basically every 2 days they're getting something. Some of those were just like, hey, here's the link to the recording for learning part 1. Others were like, hey, don't forget, you've got the quizzes for the memory chapter. They're due Sunday night, 11 o'clock. Make sure you're on track and getting those done. So showing you care, basically in some of those announcements, what I was trying to emphasize was I understood that this was suboptimal. I tried not to use any really nasty words about how I was feeling about it, but telling them that we would get through this together, that they were in good hands. I was somebody who had survived teaching 800 people or more in March 2020 and then did that for the following year, and we were going to get through it, and we ultimately did, as we'll talk about. I actually did this thing where I invited my 11 o'clock students, if they were available, to come to my 8 o'clock class. This was the funniest part for me. It's funny 2 ways. First, it was funny in that I used iClicker in the 8 o'clock section to just see if they were okay with having some of these folks from the 11 o'clock class come. Now, you probably would think like, yeah, they're not going to care, whatever, right? Who's in the class, whatever. I asked with the iClickers, and 10% of the 8 o'clock kids says, no, we're not having that. Like, I don't want those people coming in. Those 11 o'clock people are horrible people. I don't know what that was about. So after they said that via iClicker, I invited anybody who had reservations to come and talk to me after class. Nobody did. So I think they were just trying to jerk me around a little bit. So I'm the king of the class. I get to do what I want. I'm like, I'm inviting them. They're coming. So I did invite them. Second thing that's funny was after inviting those 11 o'clock students, remember there's almost about 500 in that class. Let's have you guys guess. We won't use iClicker for this. How many out of almost 500 do you think came to the 8 o'clock class to sit there? 1%. So you're saying about 5. Any other guesses? I asked my wife, she said like 30 or 40, and she's watched me teach for 23 years, and she's heard me bitch for many, many years about students. What other guesses?
Nobody?
Nobody. That was even slightly better. It was 1. So I had 1 student. I'm like, let me write your name down. And then ultimately we got to 3. So like the optimistic way of spinning it, I tripled my invitee attendance. Anyway, one of those students came up and said, hey, you know what's going on here? This was great. I loved having the opportunity to continue to be in person. So I did that. And then the final point I'm going to make here is about measuring things. So I think what happens a lot of times in higher ed is we live our lives as researchers over there, and then we walk to our classroom and we don't think as researchers in the classroom anywhere near as much as we should. So I've always been a huge fan of using my skills as a researcher in the classroom. This is basically, like, I don't have like a formal research program in psychology because I'm a lecturer, I'm a part-timer. I don't have that as a requirement, but I have always, I mean, you give a psychologist 2 classes, he or she is going to do something with one and not with the other, and then measure things. And that ultimately, this approach actually led to my having for 15 years from 07 to 22, a faculty in residence position in our instructional technology group, because I was the guinea pig guy that was willing to try anything, and then evaluate whether it worked. So I'm going to ask you now to predict, what do you think happened with those 11 o'clock students who were basically evicted by Legionnaire's disease, which is a weird thing to say, but that's basically what happened. Do you think they did better, they did worse, or maybe they did about the same? If you think about this natural experiment, this was sort of the baseline. Test 1, in person, they take test 1. The 11 o'clock class is outperforming them by about 4 or 5 points. I'll tell you, that has been true for 46 semesters. The later class always outperforms 8 o'clock class. The 8 o'clock class sometimes has their students who had lower priority for registration. The 11 o'clock class filled. There are kids like, oh, I forgot to register. Right? If you forget to register, you're probably also not going to do awesome on test 1. Test 2 and 3 were during sort of the treatment part of this phase of this experience in the spring. I could tell you a little story about those since we have like a minute. Test 2, we actually gave in the 8 o'clock classroom because at 11 o'clock, the 8 o'clock classroom was available because the person who was in there is a friend of mine and he got COVID and he's like, you can use my room. I know you're stuck and you don't have a room. So we did that. And then test 3, this was even crazier. I should write a whole paper about this. I gave a test in 3 separate rooms in our student center, including a 300 student theater where there was no flip down, like right on the top kind of classroom desk thing. They were leaning on their laps. I had 100 students in like, like a ballroom like you'd have at a hotel. I had a third room where kids were like lying on the floor and I just walked around. I got like 1 million steps that day during test 3. Test 4, we were actually back in the classroom and that's that. So the overall course percentage, the 11 o'clock ended up outperforming them. That's what typically happens. I would point out that this element, I think, is operative too. They're outperforming with respect to these, what I call the easy points. So the achieve points, which includes, again, the learning curves, which to get all the points, all you got to do is sit there and answer questions until you get to the target activity score. For the chapter practice quizzes, remember, open book, open note, untimed. So out of those 300 points, that's a class average of like 83, 84, 85. That's what it should be. It should be actually probably even a little bit higher. And oh, by the way, the other thing that's awesome about Achieve Points, if you end up using this in your course, is it gives you what I would call like a digital breadcrumb trail for all of your students. So when they come to class, I'm like, I'm working really hard and I'm getting a 32 in the class. You can look and you're like, you haven't logged into Achieve in 6 weeks, right? So like, I'm going to call BS on that. And like next time you take the class, you should probably do the things that we talked about that would help you be successful. So, the final slide I have for you is what I call, my dad mode moment. I shared this with my 11 o'clock class because I can't help but flipping into dad mode with my students because my boys are 18 to 24. As I said, I emphasized with them that they survived, told them that they had showed pretty significant grit and resilience in the face of this adversity that we had this spring. The final point that I like to make is I really have this pretty strong belief that we are sending messages to like 15 to 25-year-old people that they are incredibly fragile and they can't handle anything. And whenever I see groups of students that do handle adversity and do well, I try to hold up the mirror and say, look, you did that. Like, I did my part, you did your part. There are going to be things that happen in your life going forward that are not going to go well, right? He or she is going to break up with you. You're not going to get that job. You're maybe not going to get into that grad school. Your car will break down, but like, you're going to be okay. You have the capacity to cope with things that we call life.